welcome back to Aston here at calendar race number 9. It's the race in which 2 years ago we decided to leave Lance Stroll behind and pick up Pierre Gasly in time for Silverstone in the race following. So this does mean with the completion of this race, Pierre will have been with us for 2 whole seasons. It's also the race where Mick picked up his one and only podium last season. He arrives here with 3 podiums already. We do top both standings in the form of our constructors and with Pierre in the drivers. And I'm starting to wonder if anyone's ever going to catch us again. I've maintained that they will, but I'm still waiting, and we're nearly halfway. Anywho, no team news to talk about, so I'll see you for qualifying. Carnage. Absolute carnage. I brought 5 front wings with us. We now only have 2, and none of them have gone on Mick Schumacher's car. Pierre has been the problem child this week. Pierre. Also, rain is a thing. It did rain in practice, so I don't know if it's going to rain in qualifying, but there's rain in the race. Good job we got a 100% weather forecast. But yes, Pierre crashed twice problematically, and a third time enough to break a front wing, which was incredibly annoying because he had plenty enough time to actually avoid the wall, but he basically did the Mick Schumacher in Saudi Arabia thing where he's heading towards the wall, could have easily gone right, but decided to turn left. Worst part is, Mick actually went off at that exact same spot at the hairpin and didn't go into the wall. The person more prone to just driving straight into the wall didn't. Yeah, when I say he crashed. That was the ERS he had on. So unfortunately, Pierre is starting at the back. And I can't actually buy a new gearbox because I haven't actually put that one on yet from last time. I mean, again, part of me is kind of just thinking, do I put on the slightly less good bits in case they bloody crash again? But I want to take the penalty this time. Which does mean, Mick, you are absolutely going to have to wait until Silverstone to get new car parts, but because I can't afford both of you running at the back of the grid. Did actually get to 100% everything in the end through tactical deployment and using the right stints at the right times around the rain. Wasn't called out by it this time, but it is what it is. Can't believe Pierre. I've got no more front wings. If anyone else crashes, they're going to have to put on an old front wing. I'm hoping he's got it out of his system now. My one concern is Mick hasn't had a crash like that yet. Sarge's done a very good time. A couple of people have got penalties because they crashed into other people in the practice sessions. So yeah, when I say carnage, I mean it. It wasn't just Pierre going AWOL. It was basically almost everyone. Sainz hit a Williams. Leclerc hit a Williams. A Haas hit Sainz. I forget which one. I think it was Magnussen. Someone else hit Jack Doohan. I can't remember who that was. I can probably tell by the penalty screen. I think it was Sargent, actually. I think it was a Williams again. And actually, technically in Magnussen's case, I think technically Sainz hit Magnussen. It was because Magnussen hit the wall, bounced back onto the track, and then Sainz drove into Magnussen. So actually, I don't know if Sainz has got a penalty for that, technically. Gasly, 100% fine. Mick Schumacher, questionable. As soon as I see one faster car with Mick, I'm sending him. I know I remember the calendar situation from a couple of years back where we sent him out of the back of this line of cars, and they didn't actually cross the line in time. So I'm not risking it with Mick. I'm sending him out. Pierre, I think's fine. To be fair, Pierre only just needs to put a time in, because everyone else who has a penalty is only going to be like 3 places, because they're there for collisions. Norris 4th. I'm just wondering if Merca brought upgrades, because they seem to be quite solid here. And Norris 4th is wild. Doohan in 16th might be because he broke his car. Verstappen's 12th, that can't be right either. I didn't think Mick got held up, but it is a short lap, so 4 tenths between them is actually quite dramatic. Yeah, better first sector for Mick. Maybe he did have someone in his way. I can't help but feel that unless the Ferraris have gone backwards here, or this is just a track that doesn't suit them. I don't know what's going on. Zhou and Tsunoda haven't improved, and Stroll hasn't improved either, so Mick should be 100% safe. But, you know, the first run coming out 11th isn't overwhelmingly nice, especially as we know the Haas's are capable of things. Sargent nabs 18th. But Mick across the line with better sectors in all 3. Actually only goes to 10th. That's not massively convincing, is it? Hamilton goes 3rd. I think Alpine have brought things as well. The Ferraris have gone 1 and 2. Where's Verstappen actually as well? Because that's going to put Mick 11th, surely. Yeah. Why is Mick so far off the pace? Mick would have been fine. He didn't need to run again, but I couldn't risk it. I don't think anyone improved, which is odd. So Pierre's got everything, and then both Williams and Magnussen have penalties. And Magnussen actually did get a penalty for Sainz, because it technically was his fault, but I figured the game might have read it the other way around, because it was Sainz that drove it to Magnussen. You can never be too sure. Once again, just because I've got the incentives to get both cars into the top 10, I'm running Pierre as if this is a normal qualifying session until we get to qualifying 3. I am concerned by Mick. 1:11.7. Why is he 1 second slower?
There's more rain now.
Oh, I forgot to check for rain. Right, this could work in Mick's favour. it's going to be wet for the rest of the session. Anyone who's not done a time yet isn't going faster than Mick. I don't know why he's so much slower, but no one else is going to go faster now. It is intermediate conditions. So it's basically a case of who can do the best intermediate time for the remaining 4 spots, which is going to send 3 if you include Hamilton in an Alpine. Big boys out. Yeah, there's no point us going again with any of this, so because we put dry times in. It's definitely weird that they all send cars out again. Perez and Hamilton and Albon didn't come back out again. Why didn't they come back out again? It's not like they've got intermediates they can't use. Like, they have intermediates up the wazoo. I don't know why Albon and Hamilton didn't come out there. So it's Perez and Russell and Hamilton that all fall victim to the rain. Pierre actually does the fastest time by virtue of being the fastest dry runner, but perhaps Mick caught the end of that rain. I don't know. I don't know why he's so much off his first time. Partly cloudy, no rain on track now, apparently. So, well, I might as well use the Q3 set for Pierre, hadn't I? And I'll use the U set with Mick. Well, I'll put the U set on to start with, and then I'll immediately check the forecast. Fully dry for this session, that's fine. So we'll do it like that then. It doesn't matter what time Gasly does now, because I don't think there's anyone else in the top 10 that has penalties. Oh, Magnussen has a penalty, but it's not back of the grid. I think Gasly and Mick just missed, I think it was Magnussen that was coming out of the pit lane there. Okay, so that's a better time for Mick this time round. I'll put the Q3 set on Mick's car because he can run again. Yeah, there's no point running Pierre again. There's no point running Pierre again. He's miles ahead of Magnussen, the only other person with a penalty in this top 10. So even if Magnussen's penalty was back of the grid, he'd be ahead of him now. There's no way Magnussen catches because they all have done that time on. Actually, they might have 2 sets of fresh softs now because of that rain. It depends how they ran that second session, but oh well. So in Mick's case, it's just to see who's... Hi there, Future Charlie here, just interrupting to let you know that the remainder of this video is a post-commentary because some Muppet, at this point, muted his microphone in order to deal with an interruption and then forgot to unmute it for the entirety of the rest of this video. Now the good news is, of course, there's nothing wrong with the footage and there's nothing wrong with the game audio. It was just a case of me muting the microphone, so you still have everything else. So you still have everything else without any problems. But yes, this is a post-commentary, unfortunately, so I do know what happens, mostly, but at very least it will allow me to pay attention and answer some of the questions I had live, but I'll stop interrupting because there's quite a lot to get through still here. Yeah, it's an eventful one. 3 minutes left in qualifying 3, and as mentioned, no reason to send Gasly out. He will be starting the back regardless. So it's just Mick that we need to pay attention to. And realistically, the only person we're kind of expecting Mick to finish ahead of here is probably Ocon. 1/10, less than 1/10 ahead might be recoverable, even in this game where the margins are so infinitesimally small in qualifying since for whatever reason. I'm hoping F1 Manager 23 puts a little bit more variability in people's lap times because it just isn't a thing, really. Through the first couple of corners, fine. And also, realistically, of course, we're not expecting Stroll to be faster. We might expect Magnussen to do something because he can be better and he has been better than his time there. But he's done that time on fresh tyres. So whilst we're expecting that to have been caused somewhat by a mistake, we're not expecting possibly at this point for him to gain 4/10. And the checkered flag falls with Pierre in the pits. He's all done and dusted now. Up to the hairpin. Survives that. And looking at Mick's sector times in the bottom right there, he's done a slower first sector because of course he has. Fresh tyres, slower sector. But middle sector he's gained, and obviously we have no idea what the plus minus on those is. That could be minus plus a half on the first sector and minus 1,000th on the second. Mick does improve by a little bit, but unfortunately Ocon improves by even more. And at the very last there, Leclerc pops his Ferrari on pole, and Magnussen does grab Stroll at least, but doesn't get anywhere near Mick, thankfully. So Mick 8th, but that will be 7th, obviously, thanks to Pierre. And Magnussen getting 9th is only really relevant because he will then he still has a penalty, which I think will be only 3 places, so it will put him behind George, but ahead of his teammate in Sebastian, actually. So rain in the race, the first thing that needs to be looked at here is when is that rain turning up? And the answer is before the first pit stops. And to my untrained eyes, well, somewhat trained eyes now at this point, with no vertical axis, we're basically relying on the icons at the top to kind of really tell us what the severity of that level of rain is. Because if that right-hand side just kind of had the symbols you could see on the left at around lap 18, 20, if that had those kind of symbols, you'd be thinking, oh, maybe that peak on the right is intermediate. But no, the symbols above the peak on the right is torrential. So I am anticipating that to be full wets at the end, which means I'm anticipating the first half of that rain to probably be intermediates. And perhaps the little peak at the start might dip into wet, but doesn't seem to last long enough to really think that it's going to be intermediates to wets to intermediates to wets again. And similarly, on the far end, the rain level does look like it comes down, but it doesn't look like it comes down into intermediate territory for all that long. So I'm anticipating that we're probably just going to be on wets to the end, even though the end of the race is probably going to be into intermediate territory for a few laps at least, maybe 5, 6, 7. But probably not enough that the AI will pit, most importantly. And I don't think it will be long enough for us to pit in similar manner and regain that time. But softs easily get us to the lap where the rain gets, so there's no hesitation in just slamming all the things on maximum, particularly the tyres. So it's around lap 14.
And it's lights out, and away we go.
Good start. Obviously, Pierre at the back. He's got a good line on the both Williamses and plants himself right between the pair of them, which is dangerous considering one of them is Sonoda, who is known to go off at any given moment. However, gets Sonoda straight away and challenges Sargent on the outbound of those first few corners. Still challenging Sargent at this point, but eventually makes it stick roundabout here. Schumacher, meanwhile, also gains a position off camera because for some reason we're not looking at the person further on the field. That one's on me. I do apologise. But he's taken Norris, and we will have a look at that one now. Into exactly the same spot where Gasly just got Sargent as well. Mick is challenging Norris for P6. Still challenging this point, even though Crofty says they get past. Eventually makes it stick there, I think. And by the time we return, Mick's actually already got Ocon as well. There he is, ahead of the Alpine and looking at the Mercedes ahead of him at this point, of Valtteri Bottas. Fortunately, I don't replay that one, I don't think, so we don't get to see how that one panned out. But it was between where we took Norris and the hairpin, like well before the hairpin, in a kind of unconventional spot, I would probably say, on this track. But meanwhile, Pierre Gasly at the back still hasn't got anyone other than the Williamses. Remarkably, Mick at this point has taken the same number of vehicles as Pierre. Pierre does get Zhou Guanyu on the pit straight, so that's one more down. And in regards to Pierre's race at this point, obviously we're aware as he drives into the back of Danny Rick.
Yeah.
We're obviously aware that the rain's coming around lap 14 was what we saw originally on the predictions. So we're obviously aware that's happening relatively early on in the race, before the first round of pit stops would have been. So what we're hoping for Pierre here is for him to be gaining enough places that he's made a respectable recovery by the time that rain comes, as I get the notification that Schumacher's taken Bottas through the first couple of corners on the inside of Valtteri. Soft tyres versus medium tyres might be a factor there. But yes, Pierre needs to get enough places to sort of have a respectable recovery before the rain comes, but also be hopefully around 8 to 10 seconds behind Mick still at that point, so there's really no issues in double stacking whatsoever, because it does look like the rain was going to come relatively quickly, so being able to pit both without hindering either would be quite nice. Also, I've not really pushed the tyres all that much, and I probably could have gotten away with pushing them a little bit harder, in all honesty, in hindsight. But there's also kind of the soft versus medium degradation rates thing at play anyway. So the softs are going to go off faster than the mediums, and the performance benefit of the softs is going to neutralise probably around the time when the rain would come in about 10 laps time. They're probably going to be about 10 to 15% apart in terms of the fresh ones, and at that point the extra tyre wear on the softs is probably going to put it into the same rough lap times as the mediums would do. So I'm kind of a little bit wary of pushing them too hard immediately, just so we don't have that flip over just before the rain and those medium runners start coming back at us a little bit. So just being a little bit wary and just trying to work out how much I can push those soft tyres and still maintain the benefit of performance over the medium runners. If it was soft versus hard, then sure, probably would have pushed them. And oh dear. Yeah, K-Mag somehow spins in the middle of that corner. And whilst it looked like his vehicle was going right before he span there and span the other way, I can only assume it's the counter lock, the flip from being right corner to left corner, and that has spun him to the left in the middle of that corner, because otherwise it makes zero sense how he's managed to spin that way whilst the car is turning right. Meanwhile, Mick's on the tail of the two Ferraris, and Verstappen and DRS will be activated, so he's using them to pull away from Bottas. Bottas obviously also with DRS, but on the fringes of it, and on the fringes of it enough that he probably might not have it next time around. Gasly, meanwhile, on the back of Jack Doohan. I have actually talked over the moment I now realise where Gasly got past Ricciardo, and Ricciardo yielded weirdly and let Zhou through as well by accident. Hopefully you all saw that live as I was talking over it, but managed to get Jack Doohan here in what is becoming Pierre's favourite spot. And now the charge is on for Albon and Vettel and Hamilton, who is the only other soft runner in this batch of vehicles. So Hamilton's kind of his target at this point. Being behind him is probably the best we can hope for by the time the rain comes, as a fellow soft runner and as a fellow competent driver in a relatively good car. In fact, In fact, obviously, in terms of attributes overall, a better driver, but in a slightly worse car. So Hamilton is the target for Gasly at this point. And we were obviously expecting Hamilton to get Stroll as well. Stroll in an Alfa Romeo on mediums versus Hamilton in an Alpine on softs. We're expecting Hamilton to get Stroll. As I get a message I was not expecting there. Schumacher on Verstappen into the hairpin. Not even using DRS at this point. Just straight up, car versus car, driver versus driver. Mick overtakes Max. Now, Max is on medium, so that is part of this. But that was legitimate, just regular overtake on Max Verstappen from Mick Schumacher. Tyre benefits a thing. Sights on the back of Leclerc. Mick's just sort of having a look at them and getting on the inside of sights. Whether or not he makes this stick is a different matter. But no, falls in behind Carlos Sainz. But Pierce on the fastest lap in the background, just for no reason whatsoever. But raises a valid point. The rain comes in about 10 laps, just under perhaps. Whoever's got the fastest lap by that point is likely to still have it by the end of the race. So having that fastest lap now, crucial. Also need to get him in the top 10 though, for it to be relevant. But bare minimum, we've taken it off anyone else who might have benefited. Fortunately, Pierre's in a bit of a train, still stuck behind Stroll actually. Despite the DRS and soft tyres, Hamilton's still not got him yet. And it's not like those Alfa Romeos are suddenly really quickly, although as behind, Zhou Guanyu dives down the inside of Jack Doohan to become the car behind. But it is just a train of vehicles, and Hamilton there just really not doing anything that resembles an overtake. You'd think the 7-time world champion would have a little bit better racecraft than that, but apparently not. As Sainz has finally taken the lead of the Grand Prix as the other soft runner in that front batch. I was anticipating Sainz to get Leclerc relatively quickly and then just drive away on the benefit of having the soft tyres in the same machinery. I was expecting to pull away from Leclerc, but I guess at this point, even just 6 laps in, the difference between those two sets of tyres isn't a lot now, as using a bit of ERS and what have you, Gasly does make the move on Sebastian Vettel to get 13th temporarily. Now it's only Stroll and Albon ahead, and Hamilton has taken Stroll. Just watching that again. It's Pierre doing the move in what is his favourite place. Once again, onto that back DRS straight. He's made the move stick, and that's Sebastian Vettel dealt with. But Pierre's race right now is a case of just sort of selectively recharging or deploying in order to get the vehicles that he is naturally faster than. Also worth saying at this time, and you may notice it as well, the fuel is still on full push. We've gone to minus 0.6 at this stage. I was willing to push the fuel significantly further this time in the anticipation of rain, which naturally brings the fuel usage down generally. And here begins the selective recovery as well of ERS with a little bit of a buffer room to Vettel. Felt it was a bit safe just sort of to recharge and then push and recharge and then push with Gasly in order to try and get Albon, who doesn't quite have the pace to take Hamilton, who got re-overtaken by Stroll, by the way. And checking the weather, it seems to have shifted a couple of laps earlier. What was rain on lap 14/15 is now rain on lap 12/13, which means there's a little bit more wiggle room to push the tyres if necessary. But now he's charged up a little bit on the kind of non-overtakey half of the lap. We stopped recharging on the DRS straight, just so he can hold on to those cars and not lose them. And as his assistant says, we think we can lean on the tyres a little more now. With only probably 4 more laps of actual racing on these tyres, probably lean on them a little bit more. And as we're looking at Pierre Gasly once more failing to overtake Albon, Mick Schumacher's taken Charles Leclerc. I wish Mick would stop doing this. Every time I think Mick's just sort of found the spot where he's just going to be for the rest of this race, or until the rain at least, he overtakes someone else. Wasn't expecting him to get Valtteri Bottas, he got Valtteri Bottas. Wasn't expecting him to get Max Verstappen, he got Max Verstappen. But Charles Leclerc just left the door wide open there and, well, Mick capitalised. Max, meanwhile, at the back of the grid, not really catching the Williamses in a bit of a surprise situation. I believe both he and Jack Doohan suffered car damage, because they were the two that basically went into the walls during the practice sessions. Now, Pierre went into the walls, but didn't actually kind of break his car in that way. Obviously, he broke it and broke the pieces, but we just replaced those pieces and everything was fine. I don't know whether or not AI cars don't bring replacement parts, so he's sort of using wounded parts still. However, Mick's now in the lead of the Grand Prix. Yep, that's a thing. That's a thing. As Gasly does get Albon on a lap where I don't think I was actually deploying. But at the same time, it says Stroll's overtaken Gasly, and I don't remember Stroll being behind Gasly. So I don't know what happened on the last lap, and I forgot to look again this time round to see what happened. But Hamilton and Stroll still fighting each other. For some reason, Hamilton on softs cannot drive away from Stroll on mediums. I don't really understand it. But simultaneously, Hamilton overtaking Stroll on that DRS straight where Stroll doesn't have DRS activated, allowed Gasly through as well, and put Pierre as the first driver behind Hamilton. And with 2 soft runners ahead of Lance now, his ability to get re-overtaken is severely limited. Hamilton now doesn't have DRS and Pierre does, which means, understandably, Pierre makes the move. On the outside, still not quite fully making it stick, but it is double DRS this one. Much like Australia, it's a case of having it again on the second part of that DRS. So he managed to pull away and make it stick on Hamilton. Rain still coming, good to know. But yes, obviously Mick without DRS on that lap as well. Now under a bit of pressure too. Sainz has already re-overtaken him and Leclerc is now having a go, but manages to fend him off by the time there's another DRS straight. And now it's Sainz without DRS here. Mick's not really looking to overtake at this point. Now it's Gasly and Hamilton's turn to try and pull away from Stroll together. And they are doing so to a degree. Pierre is still having to defend from Lewis. That Alpine capable of sticking with, particularly with DRS. But there is now a little bit of a buffer to those slower vehicles behind, as Mick's having another go for the lead. Verstappen's been overtaken by Leclerc behind, which is again, that's another legitimate move because it's DRS and DRS, and in the game, everyone's in the game. I don't think they have a DRS benefit as they do in real life right now. But Mick's got Carlos as the front four just swap over basically. Mick gets Sainz, Verstappen gets Leclerc. Verstappen's having a look at Sainz as well on this DRS straight, but I don't think he makes it stick. 1 lap to go before the rain, in theory. And I'm tempted by attack, but at the same time, I know how notorious this track is for crashes. And I'm genuinely surprised the only person to have actually had a moment so far is Magnussen, and he didn't crash. Considering the frequency and severity of crashes in practice sessions, I'm surprised that hasn't been more through qualifying and through the race so far, as Sainz gets Mick again, and Hamilton gets Gasly meanwhile. We're kind of hoping our drivers may be in the lead by the time the rain comes, but this is probably the last entirely dry lap, judging by the forecast, which we now have 100% on weather forecast-wise, and the rain has started right as Pierre's bearing down on the pit lane entry. That is Pierre on the main straight, what I'm calling the main straight, as the longest one, but directly ahead of him, on the side of the track where he already is the pit lane entry. And we've already ticked up to 0.13 millimeters in the short amount of time that the rain's been falling. And with Hamilton still kind of stuck to him and a reasonable healthy gap ahead to Russell, it's certainly worth the risk that the weather by the time he gets out of the pits will be in his favour. It's going to be close to, if not already at, 1 millimeter's worth of rain by the time he gets out of this pit. And you can see the speed in which that millimeter is going up. And by the time he's even got the tyres on, we're at 0.6. Mick on the opposite side of the track and well beyond the entry by the time I made the decision for Pierre, of course. He's just going to have to come in as soon as he gets there. His race engineer, a little bit slow on the uptake there, telling him that the rain's about to happen as it's already happening. And by the time Pierre does get out of the pit, still says exiting, it is indeed intermediate weather already. He comes out the very back of the field, 2 seconds behind Magnussen. By the time he's even got through a couple of corners, that's 1 second to Magnussen. And you can see the problems that everyone else is already having. Unfortunately, Pierre makes a hash of trying to get past Magnussen here. So he only really gains those 2 seconds up to Magnussen that he'd already gained on the rest of the field. But I end up just sort of deploying everything just to get him past the pass and hopefully make the most of this part of the track where everyone else is driving notoriously slow. And a bunch of cars don't come in, bizarrely. Leclerc, Bottas, Ocon and Perez are all sacrificed to their number 1 drivers. It's interesting that Bottas is being regarded as a number 2 driver here over Russell. But despite being the lead vehicle at this point in time in their respective teams, Bottas, Ocon do not pit. Perez and Leclerc I kind of understand because Sainz and Verstappen were ahead of them, but Bottas and Ocon not pitting despite being the lead vehicles, little surprising.
Good job.
But Pierre, obviously pitted a lap earlier, now comes out behind Ricciardo. Well, more to the point, has caught Ricciardo because he hasn't pitted either. And technically, he actually lost time to Russell, being stuck behind Magnussen. But crucially, he still came out ahead of Hamilton. And he gets Shogun Yu as well for good measure. Meanwhile, Russell ahead is being held up by a Vettel who hasn't pitted either. Magnussen got the first choice there for some reason, despite being at the very, very back of the grid. So Vettel's race has been sabotaged as well. Meanwhile, Mick at the very front has caught those drivers who didn't pit at all yet. So despite having the pit stop, those drivers still on the dry tyres have lost the entire pit stop already. So they are effectively a pit stop down at this point in time. In fact, Ocon and Perez, I believe, were behind a whole bunch of intermediate runners by the time they pitted, let alone caught up. So they are even more than a pit stop behind those intermediate runners now. So their races are entirely ruined at this point unless they get the benefit the next time round when they have another set of tyre changes to go on the wets later on. Or if someone blinks during the brief stint into wet that looks like we're about to have. But these intermediate tyres on an aggressive push look like they'll probably hit roughly the lap where it is going to go to wet territory later in the race. About lap 45 is what we're looking at there. So on a 4 push, they look like they'd last pretty much exactly 30 laps. So we do have to drive around on just neutral, but we can push if we need to, is basically where we are at with these intermediates. And similarly, we don't want to push these tyres because everyone else is on the same tyres now. We don't want to push these tyres harder and then lose the performance compared to our peers on the track at the moment. But Gasly, after the first round of pit stops, 6th. He went into those pit stops about 10th, 11th with Hamilton. And the track has indeed dipped into wet territory and will probably be in wet territory for a few laps here. So I wasn't uncertain that a few AI might blink, but they haven't. Big winners through that, switched to intermediates. Mick, who's now in the lead with Verstappen and Sainz behind, he did come out ahead of Verstappen with a couple of seconds actually. But unfortunately, Mick's adaptability attribute, which is the one which affects how good they are in changeable conditions such as these, especially with intermediate tyres in what is wet weather, he's very much probably 4th best out of these 4 drivers at the front. I think Norris is better as well, but Verstappen and Sainz, quite possibly the best 2 wet weather drivers in the field. Hamilton probably up there as well, I don't really know, but he's not challenging at this point in time. So unfortunately, Mick has 2 of the best wet weather drivers directly behind him at this point in time, and he is amongst the worst, I think. Certainly bottom half, which is a bit of a shame considering, of course, his heritage is being the son of probably the best wet weather driver of all time. You'd think that might stand for something, but not in F1 Manager 23, it doesn't. So, quite frankly, I am expecting to be overtaken by Verstappen and Sainz at this point, and I'm just hoping to be able to hold on to them and ahead of Norris. I am wanting Gasly to get past Russell at some point, and he does still have that fastest lap, so that's pretty much guaranteed at this stage, unless there's a freak dry up at the end of the race and people start going on to dry tyres. And Verstappen does get Mick, but then immediately goes off the track and ends up 4 seconds down. I don't watch the spin, I don't think. He ends up 4 seconds down, but by the end of the lap, he's already gained about a second back again. Sainz, however, does get Mick and starts pulling away, so that's the moment in which I start pushing Mick's tyres up a notch just to keep himself within a second, just so he doesn't lose Carlos as it starts to dry up again. And being on the wrong tyres in what was wet conditions, full wet conditions, is where Mick's adaptability really goes against him. Now it's back into intermediates territory, it's not as much of a detriment, and he's actually able to hold on to Sainz even just on neutral tyres. Now, he doesn't need to push the tyres anymore. Meanwhile, Gasly's still stuck behind Russell, as you can see here. So now comes the time when we decide to do something about that. And this track is going to continue to dry but never get dry, as another driver locks up. I believe this was the inevitable Tsunoda. Yes, it is the inevitable Tsunoda lockup. Nothing serious, still 16th. He's actually having a relatively okay race for the Williams. But both our drivers getting a little bit over-eager into that hairpin, I think, and failing to do an overtake. But we try to hold on to Russell whilst harvesting, and there's been another incident. And looking at the times, there's one driver who's stuck on 000. It's Verstappen again, who's had an issue.
Yellow flag.
He's crashed on turn 9, apparently. And this time he's costing 5.5 seconds. We're watching him this time, and he just goes straight on where Magnussen went off, but doesn't spin, and then just inexplicably drives into the pillar. Fantastic animation at the end of all that, but yeah, could have easily just driven through that gap and decides to smack into the wall, Mick Schumacher style in Jeddah. But it does, of course, damage his wing, and now he has to take a pit stop. So not only is Perez and Leclerc down a pit stop, so is Verstappen, which leaves Sainz, Mick, and Norris effectively free as a podium positions. They are 8 seconds ahead of Russell. Right now, it looks like the podium is going to be Carlos, Mick, and Lando in some way, shape, or form. Whatever order they end up in, not sure, but that's what it's looking at this point, as I did harvest the full ERS on Gasly and then deploy him, and he failed to get Russell. So we're harvesting again as Mick locks up, and it's a big one. Thankfully, they both get back on track and nobody's out of the race. But it is Mick's fault. It's hard to tell in the rain whether he locks up or not, or if it was just an overtake. But there's the problem: front wing damage, and apparently you can't put on old front wings, which means there are no more front wings because Pierre used 3 of them in practice. technically 4 of them, but he broke 3 of them in practice. So now there are no more spare front wings. Pierre has cost Mick Schumacher effectively his race at this point. Admittedly, even right now, his estimated exit position would have been 10th place. Between his penalty and the time it would have taken to put a front wing on, he would have been down in 10th anyway. Would have still had a chance at points. It would have been minor points at that stage, but would have been a chance at points, and we could have possibly capitalised during the changing rain conditions in about 10 laps time. But he would have had to come in now to get that front wing changed, because that is severe damage. So now we basically have to focus on Gasly, who has harvested ERS up again. Sainz does have to pit as well, but we can't do anything with Mick, so it's kind of a case of just leaving him out and hoping for the best at this stage. Unfortunately, there's over half a race to go, and he is in that same situation we remember Bottas was in Abu Dhabi Season 1, where he was driving around with half a front wing. I think Norris may be in the same situation in a race last year, where they're driving around with half a wing and just losing time, significant time, every single lap and just causing carnage. But we're hoping that carnage might play in our favour here as Gasly's charging down on Russell. We deploy him in the section where we know DRS is. Full attack on the tyres as well for good measure. Trying to get, well, of course there's no DRS at this stage either, but trying to get Russell before Gasly reaches Mick. Mick has lost that time significantly already, only 1 second ahead of him now. So we're kind of hoping that Mick gets out of the way of Pierre, but holds up Russell in some way, shape or form. And watching this excellent move from Pierre Gasly on the outside of Russell down the main pit straight, alongside the wall of champions. He's done the move by turn 1. So yes, what we're hoping for here is Mick gets out of the way of Pierre, no issues, but then gets in the way of George. So we're hoping we catch him at just the right point. Unfortunately, we catch him at just the wrong point at the start of that straight. I was hoping he might hold off long enough to get to the end of that straight and then let Pierre through, but not George. I was kind of hoping he might dive back into Pierre there by taking off the fight teammate and just sort of dive into the gap between them. He doesn't, and both of them get through without any problem. So at this point, we're just kind of hoping that the time lost by Mick is enough to still keep him in the top 10. I'm not optimistic. He still has a 5-second time penalty. Should we even get to the rain and, you know, take that pit stop to get onto the wet tyres, he's still got a 5-second pit stop then as well. So now Pierre is ahead of George. We start pushing those tyres on Pierre as well, just to try to see if we can build up the gap there. Hamilton gets Mick, he's 2 seconds behind already. It's just that time is tumbling for Mick, unfortunately. But at the very least, he's probably acting to help slow up those vehicles behind, provide a little bit extra buffer for Pierre on those vehicles behind, should he need a bit of a buffer. So he's working in our favour, and all of a sudden, lap 42, drivers are pitting. And that's because the weather, unbeknownst to me, has arrived early as well here. It's gone wet dramatically quickly. Pierre on the opposite side of the track at this stage anyway, so we may have just been able to get him to come in a lap early. We may have been able to capitalise on that, but never mind. It doesn't matter. The drivers around us are still going to pit with us here, so we're not really going to lose out to them at this point. And everyone goes into the pits and comes out of the pits in exactly the same order, so there's no harm done. I say exactly the same order. Hamilton's down to 6th now. Bottas and Perez have managed to recover a little bit there, I think. Gasly's still behind Norris. Russell's still behind Gasly. Norris lost a significant amount of time there, and Pierre does get caught up. And that's why I wanted to double check, actually. That was one of the things I did miss originally, was how far behind Norris Gasly came out of the pits. It did look like there was about a 2-second gap that was closed up. So I think Norris did lose a little bit of time just straight up through the pit stops. But then he lost more time, and I'm not fully certain why. Now, I can actually see right now the dots. There is an AlphaTauri, presumably Doohan, between the three of us. So whether or not it's Jack Doohan that held Norris up or not, I don't really know. But either way, Gasly's recovered those 2 seconds on Norris. And we are well into wet territory at this point, by the way, as well. A full 6.5 millimeters of water on this track. So those wet weather drivers right now are very much enjoying themselves. And those who are not very good wet weather drivers are done. And speaking of one who's not very good, Mick, through those pit stops, finds himself in 13th. There's no reason to keep him driving out there. There's no reason to put another 25 laps worth of engine wear on these parts. Now's the time to retire him. There's no hope of a top 10 position unless half the field retire. So we'll just retire Mick. He's on that straight leading up to the pit lane anyway. Now's the time to just say enough's enough. There's no chance of you getting any points today. Sorry, Mick. We've got no more front wings. It is your fault in a way, but it's also not your fault that we had no more front wings. Mick's saving grace in this race right now is that Sainz is 7th, Leclerc is 9th, and Verstappen is 10th. And Perez 5th as well isn't a supreme amount of points for him either. This race is still seemingly a 3-horse race, 15 seconds or so back to Bottas. Norris, Pierre and George now, the three, almost guaranteed to be on the podium at this point unless something dramatic happens. as we start to harvest a little bit with Pierre, just to try and see if we can do the same thing with Pierre as we did with Jaws, as we did with Albon earlier in the race. So harvest up a little bit and then start to attack. Unfortunately, during the harvesting up period, George decides to take Pierre and put him into third, which is slightly irritating. And it happens because basically exactly the same thing that Mick did to Leclerc earlier on. He just sort of leaves the door open on turn 1, well, turn 2, I suppose, and George capitalises, unsurprisingly. So, but now these wet tyres, we can really attack them, so we do. He's got a little bit of ERS if he needs it. Just kind of hoping that Pierre gets a little bit closer to those two drivers ahead and see if he can get either of them at some point over the course of this lap. George really hounding Lando, though. Lando's best race probably this entire series so far at this stage. Probably George's as well, actually. And Pierre now hounding George himself, forcing him to defend rather than attack. And we all get very tight into the hairpin. No DRS, of course, in these wet conditions. So this is all about straight up driver ability and car power down this main straight now. And nobody makes a move. And that harvesting was all for nothing. Does look briefly like Pierre was going to have a nosy into turn 1, but doesn't. Harvest and pulling back. And it's kind of almost a decision to, at this stage, to maybe hold off a little bit and just hope for something during the remainder of this race. At this point in the race, the safety car would be actually massively detrimental. It would allow those cars behind to get, gain up on us. And Bottas has actually gained a significant amount of period of time on us. He's within 10 seconds. But all of a sudden, I'm noticing that the level of rain on the track is dropping. We're down to 4.7. And looking at the weather forecast, that decrease in rain levels is happening a lot sooner than it originally said as well. So basically every stage of this changeable conditions is happening a few laps earlier than it looked like before. And most importantly, this drying up period seems to be more significant as well. What was looking to be just maybe only a few laps at the very end of intermediate weather again is now quite possibly 10 to 15 laps of intermediate weather. And that's more significant. And Pierre is on that main straight leading up to the pit entry once again. So now's the time to make the decision. On to intermediates, we tell him, but at the same time, knowing the functionality of this game and the fact that we can tell the car to delay a lap, we're just going to watch how slowly or quickly that rain level is dropping. Because what we want here is for Pierre to come out of this pit lane in intermediate weather. And as he approaches, it's going down 0.001, 0.001, or 0.01, sorry. It's not going down that quickly. So what we need to do here is delay by a lap, and hopefully by the time he gets round again, we're in that sweet spot. That's what we're hoping for. It is going down quite slowly. So one lap later, 4.2. It wouldn't have been intermediate by the time he came out. And now this feels about right. 4.2 going down, still quite slowly, but 4.2 probably will be at or beneath 4 by the time he gets out of the pit lane. And because it's above 4, the AI keep on driving. So into the pits Pierre goes with 13 laps, 14 inclusive. I suppose it's 13 laps because he's not actually technically crossed it. Good pit stop, and the rest of this race will be probably in intermediate territory. And also at this late-ish stage of the race, I'm not still 100% if the AI will pit, because sometimes they don't pit, but Stroll, immediately as I'm having those considerations, does pit from a 12th. Basically the first driver to cross that line whilst the track is under 4mm. Someone does lock up, and I'm panicking right now. There's going to be a safety car or something, and I've just wasted that pit stop. But thankfully, it's Shogun Yu, and he gets back on track. No issues. That would have been a disaster, by the way. Everyone else getting a free pit stop just after Pierre pits would have been a disaster. But we are in intermediate territory now, and Pierre is rapidly catching everyone that's on wets. Admittedly, that is Jack Doohan ahead, who might have a slightly broken car, but watching the interval to sights, that time has gone down quite dramatically too. So Pierre having one full lap's worth of intermediate running in what is only just intermediate weather sees Pierre come out. Well, he's still 4 seconds behind Bottas and Perez, who once again are sacrificed in favour of the number 1 drivers in their respective garages. And in fairness to this time, Russell was ahead of Bottas now, but Perez was ahead of Verstappen, so it's unfortunate for Perez. But crucially, Pierre comes out a full 5.5 seconds ahead of Russell and 7 ahead of Norris through those pit stops. And now, even at only 3.5, effectively 3.4mm on track, he is rapidly catching Bottas and Perez. For whatever reason, at this track here, only just being intermediate territory seems to be a massive detriment to the wets. And you may recall Monza last year, where we went on intermediates in wet weather, and it took a while before those intermediates were really gaining on the wets. It took us a good solid 5 or 6 laps before we started to see the benefit, like a significant benefit of those intermediates versus wets, and we only just recouped the pit stop in the end on that one, and we went for a good 10-12 laps, I think, on that in that case. And yet here in Canada, even just the slightest dip into intermediates, and the intermediates are like significantly better. So I don't really know what's going on there, and it's definitely going to make me reassess and make me more likely to go on to the correct tire at the correct time, just in case. Because now I don't know. Because coming into this race, I was a little bit hesitant, just seeing there was going to be intermediates for a few laps at the very end. I was thinking, it's not going to be that much benefit being on intermediates that time if no one else pits. I'm probably not going to be able to reclaim that pit stop's worth of time. But looking at the evidence here, even if it was only about 5 laps or so, I think I probably would have been able to recoup a pit stop. As it happens, we've got more than 10 laps on these tyres anyway, so everyone pitted regardless. But Pierre's come out a notable amount of time ahead of Russell, and what was originally about 8 seconds, I think sort of stabilises to around 4 seconds ahead of Russell. I think it was about 5 seconds we had on Russell, but it does stabilise at about 4. But letting this race pan out now, there's no need to push the tyres, there's no need to push the fuel, there's no need to push the ERS. Just driving around normally and standardly, Pierre Gasly is gaining time on Russell and Norris. Norris does catch Russell in these intermediate conditions, we're saying. So they just provide a fight for second, but just drive around as normal with nothing being stressed on his vehicle. He is gaining time on Russell and Norris, so we don't need to push him. Which is good because Pierre's already crashed 3 times this weekend at this track, without any pressure whatsoever in practice. So if we can get away with not pushing him at all, that's a load off my mind. He does catch Guan Yu and lap him, and the rain does stop on lap 65 entirely. But it's still 3 millimeters worth of rain on track, so we're not expecting that to get under intermediate conditions at any point in the remainder of this race. And the gap builds to 7 seconds, still not pushing anything. Notable positions-wise, Perez 7th, Verstappen 8th, Leclerc 9th. The next 3 drivers in the Constructors' Championship, I believe. Sainz in 4th is probably the one still getting a decent amount of points here in the challenging pack. So whilst Mick's getting none, his rivals are getting, well, 10 for Sainz and 6, I think it is, for Perez in 7th. As for Gasly's rivals, right now, Verstappen is getting 4 points and Leclerc is getting 3 because of his pole. 2 points from the race, 1 from the pole position. But final lap, Pierre is still well over 7 seconds. No need to go aggressive at the end of this race whatsoever. The track probably will be dry by the time he gets, into the pit lane and parks finally after his victory lap. But his final lap of the race is still in intermediate weather. Goes around the hairpin. Still heart in mouth there, just in case he decided to have a last minute lunge into the wall. And there's one more set of corners to negotiate where crashes can happen into the Wall of Champions, and he has crashed there in practice as well before. So those 2 corners, both the hairpin and the Wall of Champions, have been places where he's gone off already this weekend. So I'm not counting my chickens just yet. He survived that wall. Now we're okay. We can breathe finally as Pierre crosses the line in first. And as a reminder, Pierre's unsure how he did that, and neither am I. Pierre Gasly finishes in first place, having started 20th. That is 20th to first. A last to first as Pierre decides to drive perilously close to that wall there. Not sure what that was all about. But yeah, last to first. And as we wait for the remaining drivers to actually cross the line here, Tsunoda's basically a lap down. The track does turn dry on the victory lap as predicted. So it was only just. But there we go. Pierre wins. And it's such a shame for Mick, really, because he was very much in the driving seat to be within this leading pack as well. So if Mick hadn't have crashed, we could have been looking at a 1-2 here. But Pierre Gasly, George Russell on the podium. I think he might have been on a podium before. I'm not certain. Probably Lando's first podium in this save. But it's a surprising podium, let's say the least. No Ferraris, no Red Bulls, who are invariably the fastest 2 vehicles. So there we have it. Pierre, 20th to first, up 19 places. George Russell up 8. Massive game from him. Massive capitalisation as being Merck's #1 driver in changeable conditions, seemingly. Valtteri Bottas only loses his position overall in the end, as does Carlos Sainz, just by the fact Mick crashed into him. Odd that he was regarded as Ferrari's first driver as well, actually thinking about it, because Charles Leclerc was the one that was sacrificed to the rain gods. But he's down 9 positions because of that. Max Verstappen's down 6 positions because he went off and crashed. Sergio is still up 2 positions despite being sacrificed as well. But he did start 9th because of Pierre's penalty and Magnussen's penalty as well. But qualified 11th because of that changeable conditions in qualifying. So he actually still gains despite being left out in the rain. Lewis Hamilton, another big winner through those pit stops as well. Up 7 positions for Lewis at the expense of his teammate Esteban Ocon, who is down 5. He went from 6th to 11th. Whereas Hamilton went from 13th to 6th. But Lando up 2. It's worth noting Lando did qualify 5th to begin with. So whilst it's a good podium for Lando, it's only a 2-place gain. And Alexander Albon, meanwhile, up 4 positions to take the final point. Good from him there. But Pierre, 26 points for fastest lap as well. As I said, nearest rivals, only 4 and 3 points for Max and Charles. Carlos Sainz does get 12 points and starts to separate that fourth out a little bit, but it kind of does look like it's a race for the title between the first drivers, in my opinion, Pierre, Max and Charles, and a race for fourth between the second drivers of Carlos, Sergio and Mick. Still only 19 points separate those three. George joins Valtteri on exactly 60 points, but by virtue of having a second place, goes ahead of him. And Lando up to 10th with his 15 points, up 4 places in the standings. Albon does get a point, but still goes down a position. 4 drivers still without a point. I don't recall when Yuki Tsunoda finished ahead of Jack Doohan and Zhou Guanyu in a race, but somehow he is 18th. As for the constructors, Mercedes do outscore us with 28 points, but we do gain overall in the championship as Ferrari get more points than Red Bull again and take second. Pierre 1,000 points, Mick only 700, and obviously retiring him early cost him a few points, but it's 37 times his growth potential, so it's not that much he lost out on. About 45 points, I think it would be, 43 points. And we get a nice healthy chunk of money too, for good measure. As for the missing car parts, we obviously need to build a bunch of front wings. We're not expecting a new front wing as a developed piece for a little while, so yes, we will cash in now and try to build them as quickly as possible. I'm not certain there's a racetrack that's particularly notorious for crashing coming up, actually, but we'll still take 6 regardless, just so we don't invite this happening again. As for designs, a moderate suspension, no wind allows, no anything hours on that suspension, so it's only minor gains on that suspension. But most importantly, the underfloor, which does have wind allowers, etc. involved on it, so that is a major upgrade piece of the underfloor again. So a new underfloor coming before Silverstone and a new marginal suspension coming before Silverstone as well. But there we have it, as it says on that page there, sensational last to first comeback. It's nice to know that the game recognises that as an achievement, but that is it from us here in Canada. If you enjoyed this race, do like, comment and subscribe. You know the deal by now. It was an eventful one, so I do appreciate any of the things you can do to help the algorithm. But that's it from me. I'll see you for Silverstone next time out. Until next time, ta-ra.